We transferred it today, July 3rd, because yesterday, as many of you know, Father Paul Shanghai, a neighboring retired priest in Trenton, who's served there for over 55 years, had his 100th birthday, and he celebrated yesterday, still serving at the altar. With a walker, nonetheless serving, Archbishop Michael and priest and faithful that gathered there, but even our parishioners at St. Martin's Church in Trenton. And so we had the investments of Valdika and John there, and so that our parish isn't deprived of the honoring of St. John Maximovitch, and we're celebrating his feast today. Those who know the saints, those who are friends of the saints, they already know very much about St. John Maximovitch. St. John Maximovitch, he's well known among all Orthodox Christians throughout the world because he served in all the world. He served in Serbia, he served in England, he served in France, he served in Belgium, he served in Venezuela, Australia, the Philippine Islands, China, Algeria. It says in his Troparic that he encompassed the whole world. He encompassed the whole world, and so the name of St. John, his memory, his blessed ministry and activity, it's known to peoples in different continents and different countries, because he served both in the East and in the West. So let's look at his life in 5 segments, as it were. He was born in Kharkov, in Ukraine, a city which is under much tribulation these days because of the invasion of the Russians. He was of noble stock. His family was originally nobility from Serbia. They fled there to Ukraine because of the invasions of the Ottoman Turks in the Balkans. And so for centuries they were in that part of Ukraine. He had a great uncle, St. John Maximovitch, who later became the Metropolitan of Tobolsk in Siberia. And so St. John was born there in 1896 of his parents, Boris and Porphyria. He went to military school. After that, he went to law school. And then, after 25 years, about the age of 25, he and his family fled from Russia, because by this time, the White Army had been defeated in that part of Ukraine, and they took refuge in Belgrade. And so for the 25 years, he was in the land of Rus. For the rest of his life, he would never return to his home there. And so he went to Serbia. The Serbians and the Slavs always had and still have a great relationship and kinship. And he went there, he studied theology to make his ends meet. He sold newspapers at the corner. He was a good seminarian. Everybody loved him because he was kind and considerate, a person whom there was no guile, he was blameless. And later he became a teacher. He was ordained a deacon and a priest there. He became a monk there. And so for the next 13 years of his life that was spent in Serbia, he was friends of St. Nikolai Velimirovich, of St. Justin Popovic. They worked together. They were collaborating together. And so he was known to all the great hierarchs and theologians of Serbia, and he was beloved for his care for the seminarians and for all who was in his pastoral care. In 1934, after some 13 years in Serbia, he was elected without him even knowing it and not wanting it, not seeking it, and thinking that they left the wrong candidate. They told him that he had been made to be consecrated as Bishop of Shanghai in China. He said, "You must have got the wrong person." It can't be me, but it was the right person. And so he was consecrated. Bishop St. Nikolai Velimirovich was at his consecration. And so he was made Bishop of Shanghai, and in 1934 he went to Shanghai. China at that time, the cities of Harbin and Shanghai, they were flooded with Russian migrants, immigrants that had come from the Soviet Union, who fled communism. Harbin and Shanghai had numerous churches. They had their own police department, their own fire department. They had a city within a city. There were hundreds and hundreds of thousands of displaced Russians that were in Harbin and Shanghai. Many of them were orphans. And so St. John, when he came there in 1934, his ministry was some 11 years in China until after World War II. He provided for the orphans, he provided for the people, he knew Chinese. He cared for Chinese orphans just as well. There were 3,500 orphans that were being taken care of. There was a house of mercy for the men and for the women. Remember, these were displaced people, which means what? They had nothing. They had the clothes on their back, that's all. So they were poor, displaced people. And so the ministry of this newly consecrated John was there in China. When the Japanese invaded, he still spent his time out on the streets. He wasn't afraid of the Japanese soldiers that were making people under quarantine. He went to the hospitals. He ministered to all people, not only to the Russians. He ministered, in the life, for example, there's a Jewish Russian woman who was dying, and he goes into the hospital, past the guards are not seeing him, and he heals her. Many, many stories there. And then when the communists took over in China, there was, again, the people that were there that had already fled from Russia. They and their children had to flee from China now. The communists invaded China. And so they went to the Philippine Islands. And so St. John remained to the very last, making sure all these people got out. And then finally he himself, after 3 years of this total immigration into the Philippine Islands and the kind of camps there that were tents that were provided for, he went and he spent his time with them. But not only the Philippines, what he had to do, he had to go continually to Washington, D.C., to the Capitol. He even threatened to have demonstrations on the steps of the Capitol building, pressuring the Congress to allow the displaced Russians to come into America. And so for 3 years, back and forth between the Philippines, Washington, D.C., beseeching, doing what he could. Of course, people, after the war here in America, it was flooded with all kinds of immigrants and everything else. And even his parents couldn't make the cut. His parents were sent to Venezuela. And he would spend time visiting them in Venezuela and other Orthodox displaced people in Paraguay, Uruguay, Brazil. This is what he did for these 3 years. So St. John, in this period, he was doing what all the time? He was with his people in the camps, where he was flying about, visiting, trying to get passports for the people to come to the Americas. After this, and this is like now 1950, then he's made bishop in Western Europe, first in Paris, then later in Brussels. And so he served the church there in Europe. Again, it's all Western Europe, so that means England, it means France, it means Spain, it means Italy, it means Western Germany. He was the bishop there, and so he goes to all these different countries. Again, what are the people there? Well, they're displaced people again, after World War II. The Russians in France and in these countries, they're poor people. They left because of the Second World War. They didn't leave because of communism at first. And so he ministers to all these people. Again, he knows their language. He identifies with them. He's the person that is always with them. And so for the next 12 years, he's the bishop of Western Europe. Then he's told, again, he didn't want to be bishop of Shanghai. He didn't want to be bishop of Western Europe. He's told he has to become the bishop of Western America in San Francisco. Again, out of obedience, he does what the other bishops tell him to do. And for the last 4 years of his life, between 1962 and 1966, he becomes the Archbishop of San Francisco. Well, that sounds like an easy thing. Well, it's good in one sense because he meets all the people he knew before. These were the people from China that immigrated to San Francisco, the large Russian colony in San Francisco, obviously. So he knew that this was the people from before. But what happens, as typical with Orthodox, there was in-house fighting. There was a great cathedral that was being built, the Cathedral Joy of all that sorrow. And people were divided about it, misuse of money, blah, 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 all this kind of stuff. And so there was court cases. Archbishop John ended up being in court. Finally, in 1966, on July 2nd, while still Archbishop of San Francisco, he was on a pastoral visit to Seattle, and he fell asleep in the Lord on July 2nd before the first icon of the Mother of God. No one was with him when he reposed. Well, there was one person that was with him. That person was downstairs, and he was up in his office, and he heard the thud, and he rose up, and Vladika John was on the floor. He said, "What happened, Vladika?" He said, "I don't know, I've never felt this before." And then all of a sudden he had a shudder of his body, and he reposed. And so that was the end of the life of the 7-year-old St. John Maximovitch. When we look at the chronology, though, the chronology only tells us where he went and what he did. But more importantly was the man himself. That he was a person that even when he was young in the military in Kharkov, that when the processions would go by, the soldiers had to be attentive and march in a certain way. But he always broke the discipline. When he passed the church, he would insist on crossing himself. And so he was reprimanded for that. He got demerits for that. But when the commander heard about it, he was impressed. He said, "Well, these are Orthodox Christians. Obviously, when we pass the church, we cross ourselves." So it became the custom then for the military cadets to cross themselves when they passed the church. St. John, when he became a monk in Serbia, he never slept in a bed after that. That he was a great ascetic. He slept 4 or 5 hours a night only, sitting in a chair. Many times during the day he would fall asleep, talking to people on the phone. But the major thing is when he talked to people on the phone, he would put the receiver down, and obviously he couldn't hear. And then the person would say, "Vladimir, are you listening to me?" He says, "Yes, I've heard everything you said. This is what you said. Da, 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 da. Yes? Yes, okay, I hear you. Don't worry about it." And so he was able to connect with the person even though his ear was not to the phone, and even though he was falling asleep as it were. He was known for his clairvoyance. He could know things ahead of time. He knew people's names when he never met before. He carried in his pocket all kinds of things. There was always holy water in his pocket. There was always phosphora in his pocket. There were innumerable lists of names of people that asked him to pray for them, and he always commemorated them. The services of Vladika John were very long. People always complained. The Polyalean and Men's included the whole song. For compline service, there were always 3 canons of the saints that were done. The vigil services were 4 or 5 hours. People always complained that he had too many services and the services were too long. His speech was a problem. He wasn't a good speaker. He had a kind of lisp in his saying and speaking. People oftentimes didn't understand him. He was unkempt. His hair was wild. His cassets were old and torn. He went in sandals. He wasn't dressed properly. He was kind of an unkempt person, as it were. And he was upbraided by that by different people, saying that you're not worthy to be a bishop. Look how you dress. You're not attentive to yourself. He was known greatly for his visitations in hospitals, even when he was a bishop. All his life he found himself in hospitals visiting people, in orphanages, in the monasteries, in the convents. He was always out on the road doing things. This is how his day generally went. He got up usually about 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. He did matins. He served the Divine Liturgy every day of his priestly life, his life as a bishop. If he didn't celebrate the liturgy, he attended the liturgy, he received Holy Communion every day. After the liturgy, on weekdays especially, he would spend an hour or so by himself in the church in prayer, and then he'd go about his day. He'd have a little lunch. Nothing much. He was a great ascetic. He didn't really believe in food so much. When there were church banquets, they just know to give him a little piece of fish and an egg. That's all he wanted. That's all he would eat. And then he would go visiting the people. He would be out about visiting people. He did this in China. He did this in Western Europe. He did that in Western America. What makes the life of St. John so unique is that this is a person who was a great archpastor, who loved the different flocks that he cared for in all parts of the world. All people were the same to him, that he loved everyone, he cared for everyone. He was responsible for putting the Orthodox saints of the West back in the calendar again. All the saints of the Western Church, the first 1,000 years of Orthodoxy, Irish saints, British saints, the saints of Gaul, of Spain and Italy, Germany, but he insisted that services be written for these saints because they were Orthodox. Western saints we don't know too much about. We all know about St. Boris and St. Cesar Sarov, St. Zebradines, St. Zedans, St. Photius, the different saints of the Eastern European countries and Russia. But there's a paucity of information and celebration of Western saints. And he celebrated all these Western saints, and he had to make sure that compositions and liturgical services were composed for them. He loved the Western saints. He loved all the saints in general. He knew the lives of saints inside and out, Western and Eastern saints. He was a great friend of the saints. He was a converser with the saints. The saints were his brothers and sisters in the faith. They weren't people that were just far away, that lived in another time and age. No, they were very real to him. He had a relationship with them. And so, now, in our day and age, you know that when his relics were uncovered in 1993, in the crypt in San Francisco, they were open, they were found to be incorrupt. His relics were taken to the upper church, Joy Wall at Sorrow Cathedral. There they remain. It's a source of inspiration, of healing, of visitation, of pilgrimages. Any Orthodox Christian that goes to San Francisco, obviously they would go to the cathedral to venerate the relics of St. John Maximovitch there. The life of St. John Maximovitch, there's dozens of materials in English, let alone Russian or other languages, even in Greek, that speak of his life, the testimonies, the healings, the miracles, the reminiscences, the sermons. All that is given and available. How much do we know about the life of St. John? There's a book that just has all his miracles, a big, thick book of the miracles of St. John in his lifetime and after his repose. Of course, after his repose, his miracles are even greater in number. People are healed by his oil. They're healed by his relics. They're healed by his intercessions. And there's testimonies of people, Orthodox people, non-Orthodox people throughout all the world that give testimony to the benefactions that they've had from Vladimir John Maximovitch. And so he's a saint that is known in the East and the West. He's the apostle to many nations. He's the arch-pastor. He's the ascetic. He's a theologian. But above all, and this is a lesson we can learn today, above all, he was a person that was developed in continual prayer. Prayer. Prayer made everything possible for him. Not just morning, evening prayer. He always had Vespers. He always had Compline. He always had the liturgy. He always had Matins. He was always in the church. And if he was in the church, he was in his cell and what was he doing praying? Not just for himself, but again, numerous, unending list of names of people that he prayed for continually. People that he never met. People that years later he would say, yes, your sister was so-and-so, wasn't it? Your mother was so-and-so. Yes, I never knew them, but I'm praying for them. All these are great testimonies. We need to read the life of St. John Maximovitch. We need to read the testimonies that are given by those who have received his holy benefits. For us here in the parish of Manuel, we're very blessed to have residing with us here vestments of St. John Maximovitch. These vestments he probably wore when he was bishop in San Francisco, perhaps in Western Europe. We don't know how old the vestments are. But it's a relic, as it were, that when he wore those vestments, he celebrated already the kingdom of God. That his powerful intercession was for all people. That he was a person who loved, who treasured, who cared, who sacrificed. A person who cared nothing for himself. When he died, he possessed nothing. He was a non-possessor, as it were. was able to read the hearts of people. I'll give only one example. St. Vladimir Seminary was at Columbia University in the 1950s. Professor Sergei Verhofsky had a long talk with Archbishop John in the library there at Columbia University. And Sergeyevich would always say that there was nothing unique about him. He was just a good bishop, normal person to talk to. There was nothing extraordinary about him. He was just a good, pious bishop. That's all he could say about him. And then the professor said, your plane is going to leave in an hour from Idlewild Airport. Before the wire was or JFK, it was Idlewild Airport. That your plane is going to leave in an hour. You're not going to make it. He says, no, the plane's not going to leave till I'm leaving. So don't worry about it. So we have more time to talk, and let's have some tea, blah, blah, blah. And so he stayed, and then he left like an hour or so later. He went to the airport, and indeed the plane did not leave. There was a holdup because of some problems, mechanical problems or something. So Vladimir John never missed his plane. He got on his plane and he went safely to his home. There are many instances of people that give their reminiscences, their encounters of the Archbishop John. All that is in the literature, in the books. People do it online. Finally, we always have the relics of St. John Maximovitch before us. If you need a friend, you want a friend, one of the best friends you can have are the saints. And St. John Maximovitch is one of the very best friends you can have. We all need people to advocate for us, to be intercessors for us, to be people that are closer to God for us, that bring us sinful ones closer to God. And so, this is the life of St. John Maximovitch. May you learn about the life of St. John. May you be inspired by his life. May he be a good friend to you. And may you too be a person of prayer, enveloped in prayer. It was prayer that made everything possible in his life. It was the energy of his life. And for us Christians, the only energy that we really have is the energy of prayer. And it inspires us, it fires us up to do the will of God whatever it is. The life of St. John was not an easy life. He had to flee his country, he had to flee communism, and he had to flee Russia, he had to flee China. Spent a miserable time with typhoid and everything in the Philippine Islands. And then finally, in his last years, he had to battle in-house problems with Russians in the western coast of California. But in all this, he was faithful to the Lord. He loved the Lord. He loved his people. He was a great example for us of what we could accomplish by prayer. Let us pray to the Holy Higher God.